Good morning, seventh graders. I'm sorry I can't be with you today to start talking about worms. I know you're just so disappointed. But I'm going to talk you through the notes today. You can pause as you need to if you need more time to write or go back if you missed something or didn't understand something. You can also always ask me questions via email or when I get back to school. So let's start talking about our third group of invertebrates. We started talking about sponges and cnidarians, and we're working our way from simple to complex. So our next group is worms. Worms are actually split up into three groups. So we're covering 3 out of our 8 groups today of invertebrates. We start with flatworms, then roundworms, and annelid, otherwise known as segmented worms. Remember, we're going simple to complex, so the simplest type of worm is a flatworm. Flatworms like this one you see here are bilaterally symmetrical. That means we can use one plane of symmetry to divide them into 2 equal parts. They do have a defined head, even though it may be hard to tell. Lots of them have eye spots. One of my favorite ones is a planarian. That's our first little subgroup of flatworms. Planarians look like they're kind of cross-eyed. They're really cute. This is a marine flatworm. This is also grouped with planarians. Then we have flukes, which are parasites and super disgusting, and tapeworms. So let's look at our first subgroup of flatworms, the planaria. Planarians like this little guy here are freshwater. You can find them in lakes and ponds, even around our area, or damp land environments, so they need places to swim and have access to a lot of water. They are predators because they have eye spots, which look sort of like cross eyes, if you can see them right here. They are hunting after their food. They also use these things called sensory lobes, which are these little ear-looking things on the side of their head to help them find their food. They sense vibrations in the water and then can determine with their eye spots and with those sensory lobes where other critters are and then go after them. So those eye spots are not truly eyes like yours and mine. They just sense light and dark, but that does help them in their effort to find things to eat. You can see that they have a nerve system marked there in red. So they do have slightly more complex nerve systems than our sponges. Next are flukes. These again are another kind of flatworm. So flukes are parasites. That means that they are living on a host and they are harming that host as they obtain and use energy. So they're eating something or a part of that host. They have a tiny little head without any eye spots, you can see it there, or sensory lobes, and they use that sucker to attach to their host and then obtain nutrients from their host. So you can see again they are bilaterally symmetrical. You can almost see the line, that's their nerve cord, that runs right down the middle of them. You may have heard of liver flukes, which are one species of these little critters. They're very common in dogs and even people. So they make dogs and people sick by attaching to their liver. Tapeworms might be the grossest of the flatworms. Many of you guys have heard of tapeworms. Dogs and cats get tapeworms. People get tapeworms. Actually, in the 1800s, women used to eat tapeworms in pill form, so it was slightly less disgusting, as a method of weight loss, because what a tapeworm does is it takes this little head and it has these little attachments here and it attaches to the inside of your intestines. So it doesn't have any eye spots. It doesn't need to see where it's going. It's just living on the inside of your intestines and it sucks out the nutrients. So they attach to your intestine, and as nutrients go along your intestine and your body is supposed to absorb those nutrients, the tapeworm will actually steal some of those nutrients, so you're not getting as much nutrient as you should from the food that you eat. So you are absorbing less calories and less vitamins and minerals and other nutrients from the food that you eat. So women would eat these tapeworms and they would lose a bunch of weight, They would not get any of the nutrients though. So they would actually get really thin, but they would die of malnutrition because they weren't getting the nutrients they needed to survive. You can't control the tapeworm and say, no, only eat 200 calories today or only 300 calories today. They rob the animal of the nutrients that that animal needs to survive. Then they get sick and eventually their cells die because their cells are not being nourished. So tapeworms are pretty disgusting. I read an article once that someone in China had a big belly. They looked pregnant. They weren't pregnant. And when they went into surgery to figure out what was going on, they took out a 30-foot tapeworm. How gross is that? Super gross. So tapeworms are gross. They are a flatworm. And just like the fluke, they're a flatworm that is a parasite. Our next group of worms are roundworms. Roundworms are exactly as they sound. They're round. They look more like spaghetti. So rather than being flat, they are very rounded, I know now you're going to be grossed out that I said spaghetti. You're never going to eat spaghetti again. They have bilateral symmetry, just like our flatworms. They also have a simple nervous system, and you can see part of their gut here. So they do have a gut as well. Simple digestive system. So these guys are eating plants, tissues of plants and animals. So typically dead stuff. Some are parasites like pinworms. You may have heard of little kids getting pinworms. Pinworms are usually caught from little kids playing in sandboxes that raccoons and other forest creatures that have been infected with the pinworm have pooped and peed in. So that's a disgusting thought. And you'll find that little kids who are constantly itching their heinies may have pinworm, which is gross, but it's true. It's a little roundworm. They just take a little medicine and they can get rid of it. No big deal. So pinworm, hookworm, those are both parasites passed through feces, through poop. But lots of these roundworms are just found in nature. They're doing an important job of keeping our soil healthy by breaking it down, breaking down the dead stuff that's in our soil and recycling those nutrients back into the environment. So generally, roundworms aren't too bad. Annelid worms are what you would typically consider to be the worms that you guys are probably most used to, like earthworms. Annelid worms are segmented worms. So that means their body has segmented parts, little sections of parts. And they can have anywhere from 20 up to a couple of hundred segments. They also have bilateral symmetry. So if I cut their body in half right down the middle, they will have the same thing on the left side as they do on the right side. These guys have a closed circulatory system, and we'll talk more about what that means in a little bit. But it is a more complex circulatory system than our creatures before this, our sponges, cnidarians, flatworms, and roundworms. These guys also have a complex nervous system, and they actually have a brain. When we do our dissection of our earthworm in a few days, you will actually be able to find the nerve cord and where it attaches to the brain at the front of the worm. It's really, really tiny. It's about the size of the head of a pin, but it is there, and it's kind of impressive that something seemingly so simple has so much going on. Lots of you guys know already that earthworms are really helpful for our soil. People put earthworms in their garden, or if they find them, they don't dig them out because they're doing an important job of recycling the dead plants and animal matter that's in the dirt into good nutrients for our plants. So they live in water and on land, not just earthworms, but also marine worms, which are different than marine flatworms, which you've already seen. And leeches. Leeches, I know, kind of gross people out, but they are really interesting, and they are another important annelid worm. So let's look first at our first subgroup of annelid worms, the earthworms. These are the critters that we're going to spend the most time with from any of our three worm groups. We're spending the most time with earthworms because they're the most common annelid worm. anywhere between 100 and 175 segments. And we're going to be counting our earthworms' body segments. We're doing giant earthworms, but we're only going to count up to the clitellum, which is that sort of looks like a big band-aid around the middle of their body. So just the front section of the earthworm. These guys eat soil, so they're breaking down dead plants and animals, and their poop is called castings. And castings are nutrients for the soil. They make soil healthier. You can actually buy worm castings, which is a strange thing to think about buying, but it's sort of like fertilizer. Worms also do a really important job of digging tunnels. So when our soil gets so compact because it's just been rained on and walked on and there's no place for air to get in there, it's not as healthy for our plants. So having bugs and other critters like earthworms tunnel through the soil is really important so water can get down into our soil and feed those deep roots of our plants, like carrots, like taproot plants. Earthworms go through the soil by sort of rowing their way through. They have these tiny little stiff hairs on the outside called setae on the outside of their body that help them row through the soil so they can sort of wiggle through. They're tiny, tiny, and they're really hard to see, but when we do our earthworm dissection, I'll point them out to you so you can see them. Our second group of annelid worms are marine worms. They're also called polychaetes. Poly means many, and chaetes is referring to their bristles, those outside bristles. And so polychaetes look sort of like they have feathery edges on the outside. You can even see their line of symmetry right down the middle, bilateral symmetry. These guys are really colorful. They're really pretty. You find them where there's access to mollusks and small animals to filter feed, like protists. They are going to be found in tropical waters. Really, really bright, beautiful colors. Marine worms are really pretty. Leeches tend to be the grossest, and there they are. And they're segmented. They're really dark in color. They almost appear black. And they do suck blood from other animals, so they are a parasite. They can scavenge. They can also hunt for their food, so they're predators like snails, insects, and slugs. But leeches have a really important use for us. Medical doctors have found that when leeches bite you, they actually release a sort of numbing agent, so you don't even know that you're being bitten. And also at the same time, when they sort of sink their little teeth into you, which is a gross thing to think about, they are putting in a blood thinner, so you'll continue to bleed, which is bad if you have leeches covering your whole body and you don't want that to happen. But it's really beneficial if you've lost an appendage, if you've cut off a finger or part of your arm or part of your leg. One of the problems that doctors face is once they reattach your finger or your leg, it's really hard to get your blood to continue to circulate around your body because your blood wants to clot. It wants to form scabs. And what they've done is they put leeches over the wound where they've reattached your missing finger or missing leg, and those leeches will suck some of your blood, and that's okay. You have plenty to give, especially when you're in the hospital and they can give you some extra. But they will help circulate your blood by sucking your blood. They're drawing it through your blood vessels, and they provide that little bit of blood thinner to keep it circulating so it doesn't clot and it doesn't hurt, which is really awesome. So doctors use leeches, and there's a little tub of medical leeches right there to help your body if you need to reattach an appendage. So a little bit gross, but very cool. So let's go back really quickly and talk about those open versus closed circulatory systems. So when we were talking about some of our more complex worms, I said they had a closed circulatory system. You and I have a closed circulatory system. We have veins, arteries, capillaries, all those little blood vessels that carry blood through our body to the different organs. And once we get to an organ, our blood is contained and goes through the tissues of that organ. That's all pumped by our heart. It's circulated through our body by the heart as a big pump. Really, really simple critters that have an open circulatory system, they don't have blood vessels. Their blood, or hemolymph, sometimes it's sort of like blood but not really blood, will sort of slosh around in their body, and it just sloshes over the organs and bathes them in that blood or blood-like liquid. They don't have a heart that's pumping it around. So hopefully, if they move enough, it gets to all their tissues, but it may not. That's not a great advantage. A closed circulatory system is a much better survival advantage if I can guarantee that all of my cells and all of my tissues are receiving blood, which often will carry oxygen to those cells. That's way more beneficial than an open system where it's just all sort of sloshing around. That's super simple. Not necessarily a great survival advantage. So a closed system is a much better survival advantage. So one of the activities that we're going to do this week is a dissection. To learn about the earthworm and all of its internal organs and its body systems. So if we look at the clitellum, that piece that looks like it has a band-aid wrapped around it, from the clitellum to the tip of their head, is really the section we're going to be looking at. This is where all the interesting stuff is. Everything from the bottom of the clitellum all the way down to the anus of the worm is just intestine. I know I said anus. You're going to have to giggle a little bit and be okay with it. So from the very top of our worm, we have the pharynx. The esophagus is the white tube that travels underneath those dark arches. So that's like your esophagus. Food goes from your mouth down the back of your throat, where your pharynx is, down your esophagus and into your stomach. Now, worms don't have a stomach. They have a two-part system called a crop and a gizzard. These were your vocab words this week. Crop is for storing food before it gets digested. A gizzard is for grinding food. Chickens have these same parts. So I think about it like a farmer stores crops. So there's my crop. Crop is for storage. And G for gizzard, G for grind. My gizzard is where those stored foods get ground up, and now they're ready to be absorbed. And just like us, the absorption of nutrients comes in from the intestine. So most of a worm is just intestine. That's why when, if you cut the worm's tail off, they say it will grow back. Well, you just cut off their intestine, and they have a lot of intestine. But we're not advocating for chopping worms up. That's not very kind. But people have observed that that happens, and yes, they can grow part of their tail back. But you could just leave him in the soil and he can do his job. That's a much better plan. Following on top of the intestine, going all the way up toward the front, is this dorsal blood vessel. Dorsal means top side, like a dorsal fin on a dolphin is on their back, their top side. So this dorsal blood vessel goes all the way along the worm's body until it reaches their version of hearts. And these hearts, there's 5 of them. You can see these dark arches. They're called aortic arches. Just like we have an aorta, a blood vessel in our heart called an aorta. They have aortic arches, and those 5 aortic arches work to help circulate blood all the way around the worm's body. So they're doing the same job as a heart. The last structure I want to talk about are the seminal vesicles. Seminal is referring to semen, so these are reproductive structures. So these 3 lobes that you see here are the seminal vesicles. And then do you see those little 2 dots? Little 2 dots right there, and the same thing over here. Those are ovaries. Worms are hermaphroditic. That means they have boy parts and girl parts, but they still undergo sexual reproduction. So when 2 worms meet, One will decide that they're contributing the sperm and the other one will contribute an egg. Or maybe the next time this same worm will contribute an egg and the other worm that it meets up with will contribute a sperm. It still takes a sperm and an egg to make a baby worm. They just come prepackaged with both kinds of reproductive structures. So that's why they're called hermaphroditic or a hermaphrodite. They have both male and female reproductive structures. We won't really see a ton of those. Those ovaries are super, super tiny. We may see some seminal vesicles depending on how mature the worm is. But what we're really going to be looking for is their digestive system. So mouth, pharynx, esophagus, crop, gizzard, intestine, and their circulatory system. So the aortic arches or the hearts and that blood vessel that goes all the way down. We'll turn the worm over, and on the bottom side, following the same path as their dorsal blood vessel, will be a nerve, their nerve cord. It will be white, and it will go all the way up to the very tippity top, and it will end in a tiny little whitish ball at the top, and that will be the worm's brain. It's not possible to see it all the way on here, but we'll show you when we do our dissections. So these are the worm parts that you need to know for the digestive and circulatory systems, and then I'll show you, here's another picture. Just like, here's our dorsal blood vessel, so we're looking from the side now. This is the mouth, going back toward the clitellum over here. There's a nerve cord that goes along the bottom side of the worm, all the way up to the brain, right up there. Here's another top view. There's the brain. That's the little mass that we'll see. And the nerve cord goes underneath the same line, the same path that our blood vessel takes. Okay? So you guys now have all the information you need to know to get ready for our dissection. Take your notes, put them in the rings of your binder. At the back of the notes and handouts section, clean up your space, and you are dismissed when your teacher dismisses you. I hope you guys have a great day.